Okay, so welcome. Good morning, everyone. You're able to get up in time, right? Good. Today we're going to talk about the path to discovery of the New World, and I use the words discovery loosely because obviously the native indigenous peoples of the Americas didn't need to be discovered; they were already there, etc. This was my credentials from the other day, and I'll just pass right over it. I think most of you I've seen a little bit of it and heard about it, so you know that I wasn't just picked up off the street to do these lectures. Okay, this is actually one of the most dramatic periods in modern history, and maybe even in world history in some ways. The European discovery, quote unquote, of the New World. Medieval Europeans generally regarded the outside world with apprehension and suspicion. They did it because they didn't know what it was. They didn't know. Indeed, Columbus actually himself had bought into this because he wrote almost apologetically after the first voyage that we're going to discuss in 1492, and I quote it directly. He said, "I have so far found no human monstrosities as many expected." And that was the kind of opinion that most medieval Europeans had of anything outside of their own world. And even Amerigo Vespucci, whose name is given to the new continents, described his South American explorations, I'll quote here too, with lurid details of polygamy, human sacrifice, and cannibalism among the inhabitants. Now, there's certain tribes that were cannibalistic of sorts, but, it wasn't consistent throughout the whole of that period or that area. Now, let's just compare the pre-Columbian maps with obviously very limited knowledge of the Atlantic Ocean. It doesn't go very far, and no knowledge whatsoever of the American continents. And the breakthrough in this geographical knowledge inaugurated a really strong period of exploration, conquest, biological exchange, and, of course, transatlantic trade. Sometimes this is cited as the beginning of the modern era of globalization. And I have lots of lectures, not for this cruise, on globalization, because that's what we live in. And hopefully it's still going okay. The Atlantic Ocean became the main artery of the world. It connected Europe, Africa, and the Americas. And it was named for the Greek god Atlas. It was a mystery ocean, as I said, as far as most Europeans, because they didn't know how far west it went. Plato himself, in two of his major works, Timaeus and Critias, and I'm going to use the new terminology for you. It was written in 300 BCE. And the reason you'll still see BC and AD is because so much history has gone into that, is the distinction between the world after zero and the world before zero. We've changed that. The archaeologists and historians have changed that, and so you'll see this occasionally. The modern era, from zero to the present, it's the same zero, is called CE, and that just means common era. And so then before it is BCE, before the common era. Not very educated or elucid, but it's a distinction so that we're not talking about only one set of religions, so to speak, with AD, because that represented the Latin words Anno Domini, year of our Lord, so to speak. And so actually, this is a time, Plato in 300 BCE mentioned in his works a utopian island called Atlantis. And most assumed it was in the Atlantic Ocean as a result. It's never been found, it's never been proven, but it still looks there, and we still have television shows Josh, whatever his last name is, I forgot, who's searching for Atlantis, etc., all the time. Now, contrary to what was commonly thought, Columbus, of course, was not the first to discover the Americas. The first Europeans to reach in the Americas were really the Irish and, of course, the Vikings. And Leif Erikson, who was the son of Eric the Red, a Viking, reached Labrador, what we call Labrador in Canada now, in 1000 CE. He left a settlement there at Lanzo-Meadow, and it's in the lower portion of the map here. It's in Newfoundland. And this colony, though, did not survive, but it was a Viking colony that they left. Leif Erikson was also responsible for doing some marketing, if you wish. He named the glacier-dominated island Greenland as a way to entice his fellow Scandinavians to come and settle there. But obviously, if you've been to Greenland, you know that green is only on the coasts. The rest of the island is solid glacier, to say the least. Now, Eric the Red was an amazing seaman. And he did an amazing thing by using this kind of longboat called a drakkar, which is about 45 to 70 foot long. It's a shallow draft, and so that it could go up rivers. And it would have a crew of maybe 50 to 60 sailors. And he used this boat to, find Canada from Greenland. But you do understand that the distances from Greenland to to Canada, basically, is not as far as the Columbus's voyages from Spain to the Caribbean. Now, there were Viking explorers and colonizers in addition to raiders all through this period of time. As I said, they arrived in the North American continent in 1000 BC, 1000 as opposed to CE, as opposed to Columbus, which was 1492, so 500 years before. The Europeans, though, did not know about these Viking voyages. They were not really publicized to most of the Europeans below Scandinavia. But even if they did know about it, it's difficult to imagine they could put two and two together and conclude that there was a giant landmass and a new continent, because that was not what medieval geography and geology had in their thing. I want to go a few seconds before we talk really about the discovery, before the New World was uncovered by Columbus, and to let you remind yourself, if you didn't know it, that China, India, and the Indonesian islands, which had been controlled by Arab traders, were the primary spice and silk colonies. And that's the trade that we have here going on. These traders would come overland or sailed in the Indian Ocean and turn their products over once they got to the Mediterranean Sea to Venetians and Turkish traders. And the Venetian and Turkish traders had a total monopoly in the Mediterranean Sea. So the Atlantic nations, the European nations that were on the Atlantic Ocean, looked for a way to bypass this Venetian and Arab monopoly, so to speak. And the Portuguese were the first to be able to successfully do that. They were able to dominate the trade around Africa and get to India and to the Spice Islands. And as you can see, Bartholomew Diaz, which is in the black arrow thing, made it down to the Cape of Good Hope, and then a explorer Vasco da Gama, Portuguese, in the blue, made it around the Cape of Good Hope, up the coast of Africa into India, and was able to start trade routes there. Later, the Dutch and the English were able to outmaneuver most of the Portuguese to gain control of those trading routes. And that's when we start getting the beginning of the British Empire, as they start colonizing some of those islands. Spain was left out. Spain needed to bypass Portugal's lock on Africa and the Indian Ocean. And this is where Columbus comes into the picture. He proposed something else, something very, very radical, which is, why don't we sail west to get to the east, and since the Earth is a sphere. I should mention that, we'll talk that in 1 second. The educated people in Europe knew that the Earth was a sphere. It wasn't flat, to say the least. And so Columbus was a fairly imposing man. He was 6 foot tall, which was unique in those days because most Europeans were my height, 5'4". I don't know, maybe I'd be much taller if I lived in that era, but I don't know. Anyway, and he was in Lisbon at the time that Bartholomew Diaz had returned from sailing to the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip. And with the success of Diaz, though, the Portuguese rulers said, forget Columbus. We don't need to worry about going west. We just go around the coast of Africa. So, okay. Spain had been left out of this lucrative spice trade. So Columbus, being denied the support of Portugal, lobbied Queen Isabella for 2 years. Spain, though, was in the middle of its fight to evict the Muslim rulers that were controlling their country. And this is the Reconquista, reconquer their country. It was only when Spain was finally liberated from its Muslim control that Queen Isabella then said, well, maybe I'm a bit more receptive to Columbus's concept, claim that going west you could reach the east, so that there is no need to compete with everyone to try to go around Africa. This is Columbus. This is a post-death portrait done in 1519. There is no, and just make sure you understand, there is no known contemporary or authentic portrait of him during his life. He lived 1451 to 1506. He was an Italian explorer. He was born in Genoa. He went to sea very young. He learned navigation, he self-educated himself, and he sailed often with Portuguese merchant marines. So he had a good knowledge of the trade winds, and he has good knowledge of sailing, etc., to say the least. No educated person, though, really, in the Middle Ages believed that the Earth was flat. And this is what they understood. The actual Earth was spherical. And the Greek scientists, and I think it's Eratosthenes, I don't have it written down, had actually been able to actually measure the diameter of the Earth fairly precisely in the 2nd century BCE. But Columbus, for some reason, had underestimated the circumference of the Earth, as these models show. He had the Earth as much smaller in diameter and circumference. So as a result, he thought, well, it is much easier. We can go west to get east. So finally, Isabella and King Ferdinand thought Columbus's proposals, once they liberated themselves from Muslim control, finally thought, well, his proposals may be worth a gamble, as long as it doesn't cost too much. And so, Columbus was quite a character, and you're going to get a lot more information from this lecture about him. He made extraordinary demands. He wanted, if he was given permission to do this sail, he wanted to be known as the Admiral of the Ocean Sea. He wanted 10% of all the gold, treasures, silver, etc. acquired. He also wanted to be the governor of all of these lands so that he could then pass that on to his sons. Isabella thought, oh, well, okay. What she did was she arm-twisted the owner of 3 older medium-sized ships. Here they are, Nina, Pinta, Santa Maria, to contribute them to this expedition. These ships, however, and where's my expert on ships? These ships were not in great shape. In fact, the Pinta's rudder broke after 3 days at sea and had to be sent back to get repaired. And the Nina's sails had to be repaired and replaced also. Fortunately, though, as I said, Columbus was a very good navigator. He had great experience on explorations, on previous Portuguese voyages down the coast of Africa. So, he was a good candidate to try this out. But the ships were in pretty bad shape. This chart demonstrates the size of the ships, too. I've circled the Santa Maria there, or my wife circled it. She knows how to do the technology. And, as opposed to a very large caravel, the Wyoming, paired to the Titanic, and, of course, now the only ocean liner left in business, the Queen Mary II, and even it's bigger than the supposed size of of Noah's Ark. And you can see how small it was in comparison. Fortunately, Columbus's ship didn't need to carry as many animals as had to be carried in Noah's Ark, to say the least. But these were very small ships. Now, here's his first voyage. Almost immediately after the Muslims lost control of Granada in Spain, and that was on January 2nd, 1492, by August, on August 3rd, 1492, the 3 ships with Columbus and 88 men sailed west. Now the crew, not being as well educated as most, were a little anxious that they might fall off the end of the world. They probably thought the world was flat. But they were willing to give it a try. And if you think about it, it's a logical decision, because after all, what could be worse than staying in poverty at home? Here there was at least a chance of a share of some of the riches. The map shows Columbus's first voyage. And he was able on about October 7th the sea is moving. October 7th, they noted, after sailing, what was the date I said? They said in August. Okay, on October 7th, they noticed some birds. And when you see birds, there's got to be some land somewhere. And so they followed the birds. And on October 12th, they sighted land. They first sighted land. Now, here's an interesting story for you, which probably isn't in your textbooks, but Columbus claimed the reward of the first sighting. There was supposed to be a reward for first sighting. He claimed it for himself, even though it was one of his sailors, Rodrigo de Tirana, who had sighted it. So you get a little bit of an insight into Columbus's character by this act. It's an interesting story of how he came. You see, he landed in, first we'll talk about the fact that on his way there, this is not moving anymore. Okay. There it goes. On his way there, he stopped at the Canary Islands. On his way back, he stopped at the Azores. Okay, thank you. Good. Okay, here's the detailed map. He landed in an island he called San Salvador. The question is still totally unresolved which island this was. But many islands, especially in the Bahamas, claim it. And that's not unlike if you're an American on the East Coast of where the 13 colonies was. I remember when I was young seeing all these signs about in hotels and the rest that said, Washington slept here. you know, obviously he didn't sleep everywhere. But this is, the islands and the Bahamas and around there have all been claiming that's San Salvador. But as you can see, he really got mostly to Cuba and to Hispaniola. And we're going to be on Hispaniola because Hispaniola is the island in which Dominican Republic shares with Haiti. So we'll be there. But, you know, those are just islands he discovered, if you wish, in his first trip. Now, the inhabitants that he encountered were nearly naked and very docile. They were definitely not Asian. But Columbus thought, well, these might be the out islands of India, China, Japan, etc. And he didn't find any gold, none whatsoever, but he did return to a hero's work welcome in Spain, and he showed off some jewelry that he had stolen from the natives, from Hispaniola, and he also brought back a few kidnapped natives. And he called them Indios or Indians, and that name has stuck for all of the inhabitants, thinking they were living in out islands of the Indies, so to speak. And we all know that that's not true. This is a very confusing map, and I apologize for it. The areas with the dotted lines show the contours of Columbus's imagined Asian continent. The black lines were done later, and they're in the middle, from a map that was drawn for him in 1500 of what he projected would be the eastern coastline of these these out islands, if you wish, which is what today would be the contours of the American continents. You know, Columbus estimated the distance from the Canary Islands to Japan to be 5,300 miles instead of the real value of 11,000 miles. He had no idea that there were continents and a huge ocean we called now the Pacific that was in between. And of course, the Pacific is so much larger than any body of water that anyone had knew anything about at that time. And if there had been no American continents, Columbus's ships and crews would have been lost forever in the vastness of the Pacific Ocean, basically. We would never be talking about him at all. Now, how did Columbus take advantage of the winds to get there? He knew about the trade winds, and let's talk about them. These are the winds that consistently blow east to west or west to east, depending on what part of the ocean you're in. The eastern trade winds, or the easterlies, are prevailing winds that typically blow from the east to the west around the equator. A little bit north of the equator, but that's the way he took those winds to do that. You followed those winds. The westerlies are located a bit further north of the easterlies, and they typically flow back from a west to east direction. Columbus knew about these wind directions, and that helped his navigation. It's a circular pattern to the wind, and he used that circular pattern to get to the Bahamas and to the Caribbean, so to speak. And you can see that from the maps there. He also brought back certain things, and I'm going to talk about this on the next lecture, the Columbian Exchange, but he brought back things that the Europeans had never seen before. A tobacco plant, a pineapple fruit, a turkey, and a hammock. These were all unknown to Europe. He also, though, made extravagant claims about gold in the rivers, in what he called the islands off of China, which was mainly Hispaniola. His claims set off a gold rush in Spain, which subsequently brought way more Spaniards to the New World. And it wasn't, though, until more exploration by the Spaniards in Central America and that significant gold and silver was finally found. He had found nothing there. But he always insisted after that first voyage, and even after the fourth of his voyages, that he had found Asia. The largest island he found was, of course, Cuba. Now, this is a little more confusing map, but you can see as they spell out what they are. The blue line was his first voyage. The second line is red. He had his second voyage is red. He had instructions to maintain friendly relations with the natives, and create colonies of settlement. I think the Spanish rulers sort of had a feeling that he wasn't really in Asia. He disobeyed the crown totally, and he enslaved some 560 Arawak tribe people. That was one of the names of the tribes. And he took some back to Spain, but almost all of the ones that he took back to Spain died on the ships. On the third voyage, the green lines, he faced rebellion from the colonists, the Spanish colonists that were there. And he's rebellion because of his tyrannical rule and because he misled them on the riches of the islands. He was arrested by the colonists and shipped back to Spain with his brothers to be tried, which, I'm not sure my textbooks when I was in grammar school didn't tell me that, to say the least. But, they treat Columbus as a major hero. Well, he discovered New World, so he is good for that. But anyway, here he is. The king of Spain, Ferdinand, finally released him after 6 weeks, he and his brothers, in 6 weeks in Spain, to get him to go back and see what else they could find. And on the fourth and his last voyage, which is in gold there, he was hoping to prove himself by finding a westward passage through this Central America to reach the Spice Islands, because he still maintained they were right there. But he failed, and he died in 1506, probably from some pure hygiene and food poisoning, leading to, he had reactive arthritis, from what we can tell. Now, this, of course, is what you have. Columbus never renounced his belief that he'd reached the Far East, but he had uncovered in the shaded area all of those. He went to his grave still arguing that these were the islands of China or Japan. And the name he gave to the inhabitants, as I said, Indians, stuck. He described them as peaceful and easily trained, and he and his colonists began that by enslaving them to work in mines and fields. The Spain argued that there might be a religious justification for enslaving them, because as Christians, they were bringing what they considered to be the true religion to the natives. Saving them could civilize them, these indigenous peoples. And in the process, of course, though, it also allowed the settlers to seek personal fortunes without doing the labor themselves. So we understand, and that set the pattern to some extent for what we have in the Caribbean and south of the Americas, the American states. The demand for manpower, though, led to the colonies to some really cruel exploitation, and Columbus's brothers insisted that forced labor was the way to go to get gold. And they said it required either the natives had to produce the gold or 25 pounds of cotton. And if they didn't produce the gold, they cut off their hands, and the Indians bled to death. So there were apparently a lot of Indians committed suicide to escape this kind of persecution. But this set the pattern for slavery in the New World to some extent. More than 300,000 Tainos were one of the main tribes, were killed or exported as slaves. Initially, there was great disappointment in Spain with this discovery. Since unlike Africa or Asia, the Caribbean had very little to trade with Spain. So again, they changed their focus to colonization and missionary efforts to convert the natives to Christianity. The Spanish were following the model that they fought in their own country, in the Reconquista. Defeat the non-believers, maybe to convert them if possible, but defeat the non-believers, and of course, get rich in the process by taking over their land and values, etc. Disease and famine, though, resulted in 80 to 90% fatalities of the Native Americans, especially smallpox, since the natives, the indigenous population, had no acquired immunity to any of these European diseases, and I'll talk about those in the next lecture. There was a real collision between these two different cultures. The Spaniards had been in a monarchy and looked for submissive labor forces. The natives were living in a barter society where gold was merely decorative to the extent they had any, and neither side understood this conflict of expectations. I just want to take a break for a second and aside and say it became a tradition, though, for explorers to erect barriers and banners, not barriers, banners in the name of their sovereign and their sovereign country. And this painting of Columbus shows that as he lands on the banks. And this practice then was followed by all other later explorers. John Cabot, sent from England, Jacques Cartier from France, Henry Hudson from England, and Captain Cook, of course, too. And to a great extent, it follows even to today. This was the flag posted on the moon from President Nixon Day, and a plaque was put there too. So even we've been following that tradition, to say the least. Now, around the same time, we have lots of other people finding the New World. There were the Portuguese and Basque fishermen following cod runs into the new area, and they sighted lands north of the Caribbean. But they did not want to reveal their fishing positions, their fishing spots, so they kept their locations very secret. And so it isn't really that Columbus was the first, even with the Vikings, of course, but it's that he and his followers, his settlers, were the first to actually stay. This is the first map to show the Americas as a separate continent, and the first map that used the word America. And the name came from Amerigo Vespucci, who was a Florentine cartographer who sailed under the flag of Portugal from 1499 to 1502. And he's the one that announced that the South America was a new continent. And they got it, his name then was put on all of them. Now, it's not unexpected that the new names were not named after Columbus, because he had always claimed he had reached Asia. This map was actually bought by the Library of Congress in America in 1999 for $10 million. It was unveiled on July 23, 2003, and it was hailed as America's birth certificate. And it's the first map, as I said, to depict the Western Hemisphere as a separate continent. And it's estimated that over 57 million people who initially lived in the new continents with a wide range of societies, from nomadic hunter-gatherers to full agricultural civilizations, they lost almost 80 to 90% of them, mainly from disease, not from being killed. Some from being enforced as slaves and not having a great life. Now, Columbus's voyages launched more discoveries, and his later 3 voyages had 17 vessels with 12,000 sailors in total, and they discovered all those other numerous islands that are in the Caribbean. Other European monarchies and you can see the English, French, and Spanish, Dutch, got involved in this, got in the game of exploration and eventual colonization, as this map shows. With John Cabot, John Cabot was also a Genoese sailor, but he sailed for Henry VII of England. France, too, sent Giovanni da Verrazzano, and we all know the Verrazzano Bridge in New York City. We sailed under it to get out. And who discovered, and Verrazzano discovered Newfoundland, for the Canadians in the audience. Jacques Cartier from France discovered the St. Lawrence River. And by becoming world travelers, Europeans gained a way more comprehensive understanding of the planet. Now, by the mid-1700s, the trade between the two worlds was firmly established. This map shows the types of things that were being traded, and we'll talk a little bit about that with the Columbian Exchange, of course. The goods between the British and North America were the green lines, British North America, the red. Primarily, British North America and the Caribbean colonies were shipping raw materials such as nuts, tobacco, fish meat, indigo from North America to England. Sugar, molasses, fruit, hardwood from the Caribbean was being shipped. And unfortunately, slaves were being shipped, as you can see from this map, from Africa to the New World and to the Caribbean. Colonization was a for-profit enterprise, obviously. What could be exploited? Because the settlements were expensive, and settlers had to pay their own way, so they had to get something to trade to pay off their expenses. These poor European migrants achieved something they never would be able to have achieved back at home, though. Native ownership of the land was eliminated. And as a result, social relationships were much more egalitarian in the New World because these settlers got to own their own land. It's just something they would never have been able to do back in Europe at that time. And we know others. We got conquistadors who looked for gold and silver. We have Ponce de Leon, who was a member of Columbus's second voyage, and the King of Spain sent him back to the New World in the 1500s. He landed in Florida in 1513, and he was the one that named Florida because it was Spanish for flowery. And he was seeking slaves, but he was also seeking the fountain of youth. And if you travel to St. Augustine in Florida, you can visit the fountain of youth. I can't guarantee you're going to look any younger, though, as you're visiting that. Anyway, Cortez, he was the conqueror of Montezuma, legendary ruler of the Aztec Empire. And that capital was a larger city than any city in Europe. These were not backward people, to say the least. But the Spanish colonial empire was enabled by the exploitation of the political weakness of these indigenous peoples. They became subjects of the Spanish monarchy as a laboring class, and it's mainly because of the superior European weaponry and the diseases. The Europeans, had immunity. The native indigenous had no immunity, which wiped out so much of the population. And this left the land open, wide open for further colonization. This is, the good news is that virtually all of the Caribbean nations that were conquered and colonized eventually became independent nations. And I have a phenomenal chart that moves on its own to show you how the European nations changed ownership over the course of time until eventually most all of these nations are independent. And we'll do that at the end of the Columbian trade thing. When I do that, I think it's 2 days from now I do it. So eventually these all became independent nations. And so that's what I'll talk about on the next lecture, Trade in the New World, the so-called Columbian Exchange. And it's a it's an amazing picture, which I didn't know, and the diseases were really horrendous. The Old World exported so many new diseases to the New World, which made the land available for new colonists. Excuse me. We in the New World, or the indigenous population, did contribute one disease to the Europeans. Anyone know what that is? Syphilis. That was the one disease we contributed. And and I have a map that shows how fast it spread once the sailors got back on shore in Spain. I wanted to mention again my book, which is just there is some in the library, but it's available on Amazon. And if you want a lot of these little intrinsic stories and the rest, that's when you travel, and you guys are doing it. You're going to learn so many little interesting episodes and stories, and it makes our existence much more exciting. Sorry. So with that, I want to thank you all for attending and putting up with me. Okay, thank you. See you in a couple days.